remember that when things get rough, you can always leave over there and come here to Sankofa Books and sit down and relax. Because this is the liberation space and the liberation zone.
By a young aspiring filmmaker from Washington, D.C. who met and interviewed Carlos Moore a little while back. I believe it was in Brazil. This is Fulani Spivey. She's here to introduce her video clip, and without further ado, we'll get the evening started. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have a name correction. My name is Fulani Spivey, not Speedy. But thank you all for coming. Good night. Greetings. I visited Salvador Bahia in 2007, and I met Carlos Moore. I read his book on Fela, which was a joy to read, and I wanted to interview him, so I sat down and did a 2-hour interview, but I condensed it into 15 minutes tonight so the audience can get an idea of who Carlos Moore is, and the name of the interview is Who is Carlos Moore? And you can hit play, Tensai. Thank you.
My parents, however, were Jamaican. So I'm Cuban.
The young lady who put that film together.
Yay.
They want me to use the mic. We have a little technical problem. Trying to do everything right in advance, and then things happen. Thank you for coming. The turnout looks very, very good. It's really for us here at Sankofa Video Books and Cafe. We are honored to have a very important person, in my view, that through the time he was born till now, trying to work out the idea of race. In different circumstances and different historical junctions, he tangled with leopards and horses, and you got to read his book to get into it, but it's a very important voice for the debate and discourse on race in this hemisphere and Africa. Now, I want to introduce Dr. Carr. How many of you know him? Could we hear some hands? If you send your kids to Howard thinking they will learn Afrocentric anything, I'm telling you, you'll be making a big mistake. There's only one class. Good. Is that the phone?
Somebody's phone.
So it's only one class that I guarantee you that your kid will be tangling the source, origin, and the contemporary history of black people in America and Africa, and that is in Dr. Carr's class. I teach there. I'm sorry to say, I'm not one of them. A lot of young people that cross states, universities, to come to what's called the Howard Special, meaning knowledge with Afrocentric angle, often get disappointed until they go to Professor Carr's class. My own son, who's tired of my Afrocentric position and his mother's Afrocentric position, I was shocked when he, out of his way, chose his class to be revitalized at Howard. And so I think I'm fortunate to introduce in our own liberated territory.
That's right.
That no Washington Post, no New York Times, no white America runs. This is our liberated territory, however humble. You see how resources are hard to come by, but I'm very proud to welcome my brother, who actually is across the street here at Howard University, to introduce Professor Carlos Moore. Thank you very much for being here.
Professor Grima, I want to say that, first of all, thank you for inviting me, for inviting us to this maroon territory. And, oh, well, thanks.
They were thinking Ethiopians. Senegal,
Should have North Senegal. That northeast corner of Africa is pretty tall, man. You keep going up. In fact, I see Dr. Smart here, John Trimble in the back, Dr. Lynch. I thought you snuck him in. You came up from Trinidad. It's all right.
Yeah,
Sorry about the snow.
Trinity's in the house.
I know that's right. Professor Grima is not only being generous as is his want. I will say that I don't know whether I would say inaccurate, because I will say that this summer, when many of us and some of the students here went to Egypt with us this summer, we were flying into Abu Simbel. Of course, when you've seen one of the most important films of the last century, continues to echo Sankofa, you see that zoom in of Abu Simbel. It reminded me of that scene, one that I saw long before I got a chance to meet this man, and you're the foundation on which we stand. So we're just trying to get the young people's minds right, so when you put them to work, they'll have some content to go with that technique and content that you give them. So I want to say that, and I know Dr. Smart and Dr. Trimble, we all feel the same way about that. It's good to see you, Dr. Lynch. I have been tasked tonight, Olivia told me and Fulani told me that I'm supposed to talk about this book very briefly. And I will very briefly, because I really think, I don't know, is this all the copies you all have?
No, we have more.
Okay, because there should be no copies of this book left tonight. I don't want to talk too much about this book, because quite frankly, Carlos Moore has done something with this text that I think certainly we need a lot more of, but he's given us a life lens. Chom sitting there by your Chom, another one of those maroons over there across the street. No question. These are the women and men on whose shoulder I stand. But Professor Moore, he sent me back to Castro. Consistently defiant, consistently contrarian. But what came to mind immediately in thinking about themes to pull out of the text, and it's a substantial text. I mean, the text goes almost 400 pages. It reads lightly, but like most good reading, it sinks in and it hits you as you go through experientially, so you're actually looking through his eyes. I think you got a glimpse of it with Fulani's wonderful film there. You got a sense of how he's able to communicate his sense of being in a place. But the thing that struck me initially was this question of exile, which he actually closes the book with. And I thought about the Palestinian thinker, Edward Said. I think it was Representations of the Intellectual, that when he talks about this question of what it means to be an exile, it means to live in a series of half involvements and half engagements, never quite a member of the place you're in and never quite a member of the community that you come from, so that this being skilled and adept at survival becomes the center of identity. And I think if nothing else, Carlos Moore is a survivor. And he's here to tell the tale. As old folks used to say, I mean, you gotta go through a test to have testimony. And this is what this is. I'll mention three themes. Three themes framed by context, because you're going to talk about this work, man, so I'm not about to do that. But I will say this. The context is experience. If nothing else, a compendium of major thinkers, activists over the last century, you're going to read about in this book. I mean, people like Louis Michaud. And you know, I'm not from D.C., Dr. Hunter sitting over there. I'm thinking about, I don't know much about D.C., so everything to me is a discovery. It's probably a twice-told tale to you all. I mean, I realized that, I guess, Elder Lightfoot Michaud, that's his church here across from Howard Hospital, but his brother Louis had the Bookstore in New York. This guy is a superhero in bibliophile circles and book collector and book seller circles, and this space is really part of that genealogy. So for when you talk about the house of proper propaganda and common sense and Louis Michaud, You're talking about a man who literally pried open the minds of hundreds of thousands, emptying into millions of Africans over the time that his bookstore was up there on 125th Street. And so when Carlos Moore gets there and comes into that space, and this man just allows him to read. He said he had money for books. By then he was trying to get out from under his father's thumb. You know, his father had a little allowance. That wasn't going too much. So he would get from Brooklyn, go uptown. Nobody knew where he was, I guess, except that one teacher at Boys High knew where you were. Your father definitely didn't know you up there, up under Mr. Michaud. Learning this history, learning this culture. And then, of course, Maya Angelou walks in one day and takes him into the next phase, including hanging out with Max Roach and Abby Lincoln. Are you serious? I mean, this is what this book, page after page after page. So when they rush the United Nations after Patrice Lumumba is killed, Carlos Moore is the one sneaking people in by recycling the past back and forth, because he's been hanging out with the Congolese delegation doing translations. I mean, but this is what this book takes you through, an experiential rehearsal of the last several generations, really, of the African experience, not only in the United States, not only in the Caribbean, not only in the Spanish Caribbean, but globally. Trying to get to the Congo. Can't get there before Patrice Lumumba is killed, but ends up eventually all over the continent, whether it be in Tanzania for the Sixth Pan-African Congress, where the Cubans try to put a hit on him and Julius Nyerere pulls him out of the fire, at least long enough to get him out of the country, whether it be in Nigeria at FESPAC, trying to go back and forth with Alouine Diop, who's allowed him to publish in Présence Africaine, and then they send him to Nigeria, and then, I mean, you go back and forth, but he's recorded it all here in readable prose. Three things, it seems to me, that come immediately to mind. One, the question of power. What do you do when you're confronted with power, institutional power? I mean, it's one thing to say there's racism in Cuba. And I mean, just the names alone that really blew my mind, beginning with, of course, Walterio Carbonet, right? Yeah. This brother just made his transition in April. I mean, this brother's a young ancestor. But this man's intellect alone, and there were several other brothers, of course, Cogilio Martinez Pure, who has just published, I understand, very recently, a massive work chronicling poets of African descent from classical antiquity to the present. And most of his manuscripts never been published. He's sitting on the shelf at his house, right? Show Professor Moore. These are scholars in Cuba who have largely been silenced. And in a very tragic turn in terms of Walterio. I'm not going to give it away. You had to buy the book to understand what happened to this brother. But then you have Carlos Moore apprenticing under these master scholars who has the temerity to, in the arc of the revolution, not only challenge the notion that race is not a factor in the revolution, that racism is indeed alive and well in the revolution, but then has the nerve to, when Fidel Castro pulls up going somewhere, say, "Hey, Fidel," and run up to the limousine, past the bodyguards, and say, "Look, I need to talk to you." Of course, he ends up in the work camp at some point as a consequence of that kind of conversation. But again, you need to read the book, because you think I'm taking you through the book. I'm not going to do that. This first thing is, how do you challenge institutional power? You don't challenge it by silence. Remember something Monroe Trotter said a long time ago. Why be silent? When Booker T. Washington was running up, getting the largesse of the major institutions in this country, Trotter told Du Bois, why be silent? Now, there are a lot of answers to that, and a lot of people in this book will give you the sense that they had very good and reasonable answers, but Carlos Moore has never been a reasonable man. It doesn't appear to me from this book. Maybe he is reasonable, and maybe he's fronting in this book, because you know everybody is a hero to themselves sometimes in their autobiography. The second thing, however, that I would say about this book in terms of deal with institutional power is one. The second is personal choices. This is not a book where he's a hero on every page. It's a very personal book. He talks about what it means. See, I don't know how much of this you're going to talk about, so maybe I'm not going to say any more about that, Lil, because see, you might... It's funny to me, because any number of examples come up to me. The one that involves Maya Angelou and some records in her apartment after you went somewhere on the jet. Maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. My point is that he reveals himself in a way that's very human. We all know we have flaws. We all know we have character challenges. The Yoruba people say, for example, that why are we on earth? You're on earth to work on your character. That's the purpose. To become a better human in the world. So when you read this book, you get a sense that here's a man who made some choices because he had to eat that may have come back through a different lens to make him perpetually ill at ease. That's no secret. We all know Carlos Moore is a CIA agent. And because he is, he's able to talk about the fact that as a CIA agent, y'all hope y'all know I'm playing. Or not, but my point is, if you want to have that conversation with him, you can have it. Why? Because he deals with it in the book. He don't skirt around any of this stuff. I was with this one. Oh yeah, I did. I was with Joseph Bimby very early on. But why are y'all telling this lie on me? I'm going to quote your book on me. In other words, he's not going to avoid the difficult conversation. And I respect that. Why? Because that puts us in a position to have the difficult conversation. You got to resolve contradictions, but you can't resolve them without bringing them up. Finally, and maybe this is something I'll end with, this idea of defending Africa. That's a beautiful thing. It's one thing to defend, or to be anti-racist. It's another thing to defend African culture. So when a man comes into a space and is seized by the Orisha and starts speaking in a language that comes out of the Kikongo region of Central Africa, and then very shortly after finds himself in Africa, in part because I think when those Orisha made you nick your leg with that machete, that's what got you out of that work camp. But the point is that he embraces the idea of what it means to be human in the world through a lens that African people created. And in doing that, I think that probably has been the thing that's allowed himself to sustain himself. He didn't create himself. He comes out of and empties into a genealogy. So with that, Professor Green, I'm going to stop because y'all, none of these books should be here when y'all leave. Thank you for this, man.
Dr. Carr is going to ask all his students to buy this book.
Yes, sir.
It has to be read.
Well, let me tell you.
For us, go ahead.
No, don't move. I'm going to say, every year in Philadelphia, because I'm still living there, I think I'm going to move down here shortly, though. I pick a book for roughly about 250 high school students to read this summer. I think they're going to read this book. I got to figure out who we're going to get in the rotation. We pick books one summer and they read the book all summer. This is a book they need to read. So don't worry. If they don't buy it here, we're going to be selling it.
Here at Sankofa, I think we believe in the 21st century, a lot of young people now have to be committed to raise the issue of race at a time that we are made to believe we're being paid by one brother getting into the White House. So it's going to be a serious thing for me, for young people and people who are activists, to say the most unpopular things in a very difficult time where everybody is not interested in hearing. So Carlos, more symbolically for us, is going to unleash a very important topic in the 21st century, race, because I do believe it's always compromised. The black bourgeoisie and the liberal whites will continue to compromise the issue of race, which makes it never go away. They say, wouldn't it go away now with Obama? I met a lot of folks from here to Europe telling me after Obama things are over now. I guess that's what white liberals think, but I think it unleashes the third level where black people have to begin to think about class also. And so he brings a very important idea, fighting on something while not leaving the idea of change. For me, when he went to a lot of folks, the activists who were against him, one thing they don't know is when he wanted to defect from Cuba, he didn't go to where usually you go, where you are met by the Spanish ambassador or some Latin American countries or the American embassy or American, Canadian, anything. He went straight to Guinea-Conakry embassy. That automatically says about what he's trying to insist. Even if I'm alone, I'm going to remain revolutionary. I think that's a very important thing that most societies who flirt around socialism fail to do, is that one can become only one and still stand his or her principles. And I think we, here at Sankofa, we're honoring this principle. Whether we agree, disagree on different approaches is another thing. The other thing is, the most principled black people he has crossed their life. Abdias Nascimento. we get a good sound of this. And so I'm going to put something in you and just hold this as you talk if you can. And move around the mic here.
So I have
This,
to,
yeah, you have to be here still.
Okay.
That's just for the video camera. You still have to use this. And then I think you're...
called also PALU, the PALU organization. So you had five of these five big religious brotherhoods that were the ones which sustained the black population in Cuba throughout the period of slavery. They were the ones who
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I want to make sure I'm not going to be like Kylie Guima.
Okay.
Anyway, I've been following Cuban politics for about 30 years. Since 75, when those Cuban troops was brought over there into Angola and they kicked the South Africans back into Namibia. Those of you not familiar with it, I was a young college student. I used to go to some lectures. But anyway, I lived in Miami for 2 years, 91 to 93, and I got really immersed in the Cuban situation. I read about Carlos before. And the Miami Herald in 1991 or 92, I don't remember the exact date, ran an article about 10 pages showing the makeup of Cuban political structure. And there were 21 members of the Politburo. One was black, and he was a light-skinned black. And I learned also that blacks were the majority in Cuba. The last thing is that one of the guys who were Assistant Secretary for Latin America, I think his name was Eisenstadt, a white fellow. He came from a think tank, and he was also a contributing columnist in newspaper. And he wrote an article that said that if the United States, or if Castro regime fell, if they think they're going to put the Cubans who are in Miami back in there, they'll be in for a crazy story because the blacks in Cuba will feel like they will take over the situation. But my eyes have been open. I thought I knew a lot more about Cuba, but just listening to him tonight, I learned a great deal more. Thank you.
Thank you. Who else?
Thank you. I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. My
Give
question
us
was,
the
mic, anything, mic, bro.
sister, move fast. Thank you.
Be like Oprah, move fast.
You don't want to riot here.
my question to you was,
That's okay. Go ahead.
you have spoken about Fidel Castro in a way that I think is very enlightening, but is absolutely contrary to the revolutionary image he has, not only within Cuba, but also I would think throughout the black diaspora, is, working with Nelson Mandela, being seen with, Minister Farrakhan, everybody that we love and respect also as revolutionaries. And so I'm wondering how you have rationalized the image that he has as a revolutionary that's loved, by us, but at the same time, he is essentially, from what you're saying, at the head of a racist state. Even if he is not expounding this, you don't have to call me Pinchon if you treat me like one. It's essentially the same thing. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Hold the mic, my brother.
I think you
diversify the gender issue. I don't
You know me now.
As a person who has
Excuse me, I don't. We will do it. You're not managing it. Please don't start this stuff. Go ahead, my brother. Get the bodyguards out of here now.
as a person who I do not to be your same age and who's been inspired by many of the same things that you have been inspired by actually. Robert Williams I was a member of RAM, one of the people who started the Black Panther Party. I mentioned Soul Book, which was really one of the first journals, who went to Mashaw's bookstore, who knew Malcolm, who got the same inspiration from Malcolm, and who was part of the Panther, the early Panther, realized the same contradiction that you represent is a contradiction I've dealt with, being a nationalist. And I would want you to say also, there's a distinction between Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, and we don't use the term civil rights to apply to all of them. Civil rights leaders are people who want laws to change within their societies. Black separatists and nationalists, as we call ourselves, or the Elijah Muhammad and the Malcolm X, I would not call them civil rights movement, but you could respond to that as you will. But as a person, I was well aware of you many years ago, and part of your struggles in Cuba became why we separated, why there was two Black Panther parties. One Black Panther Party that remained true to black consciousness, and the other Black Panther Party that we all know about, who were so-called revolutionaries, the Black Panther Party for self-defense. That story has not yet been told, because it's the same story you're telling now. It's the story of race loyalty, cultural loyalty versus some abstract notion of classless society, which in truth is never true, and probably could never possibly be true. It's the exact same story. It's the adventurism, the murder, the gangsterism, the kind of exploitation that occurred by people who rationalize a class struggle or a utopian society in which race or one's basic identity doesn't matter, when it matters more probably than anything else in life. So I say, being aware of you, being my life, being the same age, going through the same thing, knowing the same people that you knew, going through the same, it's just, I feel honored that I've been able to my paths cross with yours. And I know this is a speech and not a question, but it's a statement, and I feel compelled to make it. And thank you very much, brother, for your honesty.
Pass it to the sister.
Does he want to respond?
Yeah, no, it's a statement. It's a statement. It's not a question. It's well taken.
All right. Okay, good evening. My name is Asantua Nkrumah Ture. Professor Moore, two things. When you say that my big brother Kwame Ture supported your work over the years, in what specific ways did he support your work, given his strong support, respect, and solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, the leadership of Fidel Castro and the Communist Party of Cuba, and his own steadfast commitment to the day that he passed away 10 years ago this year to socialist principles? Also, there was an article in the Miami Herald, November 9th of this year, where the reporter quotes you as saying, the fact that I turned eventually against communism and the Castro regime, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Are you saying now, because of the problem of racism in Cuba and that experience you had, that you are now also against socialism and socialist principles?
No, listen.
Scott, and I appreciate your comments about having a civil discussion. I just want to share some comments or remarks that my mother made around Fidel Castro some years ago. When she told me that she remembered when Fidel Castro took power in Cuba, and that for the first time whites lost and that blacks gained everything. And I can't help thinking that when hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of black people came out to greet the Cuban UN delegation in Harlem, when Malcolm X arranged hotel accommodations at Hotel Teresa, that they must have had a similar sentiment about Fidel Castro, that people did not look at him as being white, but as someone who defended the interests of black people, not just in Cuba, but around the world. And I think you have to look at the facts of what the Cuban Revolution has done in support of the various liberation struggles in Africa, what they have said about the civil rights movement in the United States, what they've said about numerous things against racial oppression. And the fact of the matter is that all kinds of racial barriers that existed in Cuba before the revolution were simply thrown out the window. And black Cubans today are some of the strongest supporters of the Cuban Revolution. It's not just the individual, it's the entire system.
Let him answer. That's a good point.
No, you see, there's one thing.
Good to see you after so many years. My name is Tariq Oduno, Brother Oduno, as an African nationalist, out of the unapologetic African internationalist, long before the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Community League, and up to this very point in time. The UNIA African Community Leagues in Cuba. What were your experiences with the communication of the UNIA African Community Leagues with the African nationalist pioneer movement of the undaunted Carlos A. Cook in Harlem, who also was a student, like many of Professor Mashaw? And what was his perception of the Cuban Revolution?
I thought I was going to be able to go and eat.
For a while.
No, we have some more folks. We have a chance. Go ahead.
There seems to be somewhere in this discussion a serious concern about leadership. And we find today a critical leadership of four men: Mao Zedong, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, and Fidel Castro. I want to be very clear that we understand those four men, because if Steve Biko had to write about Nelson Mandela, you could imagine what he would say about Nelson Mandela and ANC. C.L.R. James wrote a very critical book on Kwame Nkrumah and his leadership and the failures of that leadership. Yours is a critical book about Fidel Castro and the failure of his leadership, not only on one particular issue, the issue of racism, but that must extend throughout the Pan-African world with regard to both military, economic, and political strategy, which has to be dealt with. And it must come out of a history that deals with Antonio Maceo as a Cuban leader in a strategic point in the 19th century, coming into the 20th century, and what his assassination meant to Cuba and to black people. If that is the case, then how do we assess Mao Zedong, Nelson Mandela, Kwame Nkrumah in our assessment of Fidel Castro? I'm not asking about Fidel Castro, I'm asking about these other people, although I know that's not what we're about. We're here to deal with your narrative, but you know these men, and you know the critiques that have been offered by them, and how does that critique weave into today's politics? Because divine leadership might just be the critical question of the 20th century as we celebrate on January the 21st, a kind of divine leadership that we may soon have to criticize on January the 22nd.
Or 21st. Or 21st.
on the second part. But you see, I don't, you see, it's very
A lot of you know me. I've worked with Kwame Ture since 1966. I served as one of his secretaries from 1967 to 1998. And I spent 7 years in jail for him. And I went to Guinea when it was time to bury him. So I know a little bit about Kwame Ture. I haven't had a chance to read your book yet. I'm going to buy it, and I'm going to read it because I followed your career since the mid-1960s when I stumbled into a Communist Party bookstore in Chicago, and they told me to read your book. And then Haki later published one of your first publications in this country.
That's right.
So I'm not here to discuss Fidel or Raul. Everybody knows we support them. They will defend themselves. Unlike Ackland, I'm not waiting until the 22nd to condemn Barack Obama because I know who he is. And black faces representing the Democratic Party machine out of Chicago and the Kennedys and the Clintons mean absolutely nothing to me.
Come on now.
We've moved beyond quantitative questions of blackness to discuss qualitative questions of goodness. So, I just want to put that out there. Yes, we have gone through a stage, and we must still go through a stage, arguing for black this, black that, black the other. But Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell ain't really black to me. And blackness in Haiti and blackness in the Congo speaks about the failure of capitalism in this country throughout the world. I'll say that just quick, and then one quick comment. I have major differences of facts, not of relationship. I know your relationship to Kwame Ture. We spoke about it the week he died in Conakry, Guinea. I never met you before. I know his relationship to Robert Williams it is not as you say. In fact, the last assignment he gave me was to continue the research on Robert Williams to see if in fact the rumors were true. And I'm still working on that.
Which rumors about Robert?
The rumors of him being an agent. Kwame Ture would never say that.
My brother, can you come to the question?
Yeah. Question. Everything is in context.
Okay.
What is the context historically, politically of your presentation here tonight? How do you view the context of your presentation in Cuba, in the United States, and in the world at this juncture when forces are mobilizing to send black youth to Cuba to fight what is a Cuban affair? Thank you.
That's right, that's right.
Go ahead.
Listen.
Excuse me, one thing. The mic should really go to the back. Those sisters have been at
There are
it.
two sisters here.
Yeah, as he answers, just move the microphone there. Go ahead.
Since the problem is about context, and you say that
I have the mic. Okay, I'm not here to criticize you with Castro because I understand, you know, your position on that. However, I did hear what I thought was faint praise for Batista. And my father was a merchant marine, and even before I was born,
I didn't praise Batista.
let me just say one thing. He was going to Cuba like every 2 or 3 weeks because he was working for Cunard Lines, and they were getting bananas and whatever from Cuba and bringing them up. So he was going there constantly, and he said the racism under Batista was unbearable. He doesn't know what it was like under Castro because once Castro came in came the embargo, so he never went there again. But I grew up being told that when they stepped off the ships in Havana, that there were white pimps pimping little teeny black girls to the point where, even though that was closer to home, he decided he could not go to Cuba anymore because he could not stand it. And he decided rather than take a 4-day trip to Cuba, he'd take a 2-week trip to Europe on a different ship because he said it was unbearable what was happening with Batista in Cuba.
Okay, my sister, I wish you could read the book because he does address this whole contradictions you're talking about. It's in his book, actually. But the thing is, I will let him answer you, but I just hope you guys would read his book because it's really important to let people, once they write it, do not be threatened by an intellectual output. You should take it and, as he said, then formidably present different narratives. Black people need more books, more stories. Our stories need to be told. The minute we become obstacles to our voice, what else is there about? Go ahead.
No, let me just address one thing.
Okay.
Listen.
First off, I just want to thank you for coming here. And
Microphone.
oh, I'm sorry. Okay, first off, I just want to thank you for coming here. And as the first Howard student who has been handed the mic tonight, I just want to officially invite you to come back. My first question is, how do you believe one can effectively criticize those who are criticizing, such as Fidel Castro? Those who criticize the U.S., imperialism, racism, these things that need to be criticized and pointed out. But so like, what do you do and what don't you do and how do you go about this? Oh, and also, could you give us your opinion of Hugo Chavez and his relationship with Castro?
The first thing I would say to answer your question, especially
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Soda Mayoli. I'm from Azania, South Africa. My question is this. You intimated earlier on that Fidel Castro and his regime and the people around him have a phobia for people of color being in power. I hope I was not mistaken, you said that. And having said that, do you believe what do you think of Pentagon and CIA and the State Department? Do you think they don't know about that? And if they did know, don't you think they would use it in Cuba to get black folks in Cuba to rise against Fidel and the people around him in power?
I cannot speak for the CIA.
The white guy. Let's have some, contrast here. Go ahead.
Okay.
Then after him, you, okay? Go ahead.
Okay, I wanted just to
We're
ask.
fair, unlike the outside world, we are fair here. Go ahead.
My question is about a statement you made earlier in your presentation, which at first I thought was maybe a passing reference, but then you repeated it, so I'm just like to get you to explain it more. You were speaking about Pena Diaz, and you said he was the only intellectual black who was with Fidel,
Yes.
and if I heard you correctly.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And then you went further and you said, you counterposed that versus the others who were soldiers, was the term you used. And you said, for example, Juan Alameda, who was a soldier. So first of all, I'm wondering what exactly is the distinction you're making. And just one other thing, to point out that Juan Almeida continues to be a central leader of the Cuban Revolution, commander of the revolution. Two other blacks who fought with Fidel, just to give an example, Harry Villegas, who's today leader of the Association of the Combatants of the Revolution, and Victor Drake, who I'm not sure what his current position is, but he just finished serving as the Cuban ambassador to Equatorial Guinea. And you said before, I'm only paraphrasing you now, but I think I understood you saying that you felt that the key question, I think you were saying that that race is more of a key question than class. Maybe I misunderstood you, but I think that's what you were saying. But what is this distinction that you're making between an intellectual and a soldier, which another way of, it sounded to me like was you're talking about an educated versus uneducated, or possibly you're making a class reference. Maybe you're not. I'm just using your words and trying to get you to clarify.
No, you see, in the
Before we didn't go ahead, my brother. You didn't want it. We sent you the mic by airmail. Go ahead. Go ahead, my brother.
My name is Jay Stewart. I teach at Howard University in the Political Science Department, and I had two questions. One was, what was your assessment of current black leadership in in Cuba, specifically Esteban Lazo Hernandez, who is the vice president of Cuba and who's quite vocal on issues of race, and also Pedro Saez Montejo, who I think at one point at least was the mayor of Havana.
Yes.
So your assessment of the new generation, basically, of black leadership. And then second, next week is CARICOM Cuba Day, and I wondered what your thoughts were about the possibility of Cuba joining CARICOM.
Okay, pass the mic to the sister there. Let's hold it. Go ahead.
Well, let's start by CARICOM first. And of course,
I have two questions or two statements.
Speak in the mic.
I have two questions or two statements.
Go ahead.
And one is that, first of all, in terms of it's the question of color and blacks, the racism exists whether it's communism, socialism, whatever the hell it is. We're always getting kicked in the butt. Period.
Amen.
Okay? There are a lot of African nationalist people. If they went to Africa, they couldn't survive 3 days. They wouldn't know how to do it. There's no safe way there. Okay? Let's be real. The second thing is that there's racism. The fact that you talked about this, and I heard you on WPFW the other day. And anyway, there's another thing too, but I was like, huh, racism in Cuba? No. The PR has been very good. Fidel, Fidel, Fidel. You know, we never think about it. We never think about it. Therefore, many of us, we just can't see what you're talking about. I mean, I do, but some other people say that couldn't be possible. But the question is, this is from your book, what happened to your mother?